Welcome to Black Hat Briefings. This is a panel discussion on the national ID debate. I want to introduce the moderator. This is David Morton. And please turn off your cell phones.
Testing.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. Hi, I'm David Mortman. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for Siebel Systems. And today we're going to talk about national ID cards. Initially, this discussion was to be more of a generalized debate about whether or not we should have a national ID card here in the U.S. But back in May, we passed the Real ID Act, and well, we seem to have one whether we want one or not now. So this is going to be a more general, more specific discussion about the Real ID Act and its potential ramifications for us here in the U.S. So before I actually get too much into the specifics of Real ID, what I want to talk about is national ID cards in general, and what are some questions we should be asking ourselves before we actually, as you're building a national ID card, what questions should you be asking yourself so you can design it well? First question is probably the most important one, is what's the purpose of this system? What's your goal? Are you trying to identify citizens? Is this for voting? Is this for healthcare? Is this about immigration, terrorism, identity theft? These are all things you need to think about. The next question is, who actually gets a card? Is it voluntary? Is it mandatory? I guess that's a later question. I'm getting ahead of myself, but I guess that's allowed. One of the big questions for a lot of folks in the various discussion forums is, what's the scope of data that gets gathered? Are we talking fingerprints, biometrics, social security numbers, address, you name it? Various people around the world use different systems. This has been a big concern for a lot of privacy advocates. Even bigger than that, though, I keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger here, I guess, is who has access to this data? What can they do with it? What types of queries are allowed? And under what circumstances are they allowed to make those queries? As I said earlier, participation, is it voluntary? Is it mandatory? Do users have to consent to getting their IDs checked? Today in most states, when you get your driver's license, you actually agree to show your driver's license when any law enforcement official asks to see it. But does that mean you have to show it at the grocery store to buy beer? Most people say yes, but certainly in a lot of other countries you don't have to do that. And what legal protections are there for system integrity, privacy, due process? This is obviously a very large issue for a lot of folks. So before I get too much into the Real ID Act, I'm actually going to ask each of my panelists to introduce themselves and give a little of their thoughts on national ID cards in general.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Harper. I'm the Director of Information Policy Studies at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., a libertarian think tank, and also the editor of a privacy policy website called Privacilla.org. That's privacy, drop the Y, and add Godzilla's tail. Let me go really quickly through identification as a theoretical response to terrorism and how it falls down. And then I'll address attempts to improve identification in the name of preventing terrorism, which the Real ID Act intends to do. Again, really quickly, because I want to do discussion, which is always the most profitable part of any panel. The ordinary uses of identification are to maintain relationships, that is the people you see, your family, your friends, so on and so forth. For accountability, social sanction, and civil and criminal sanction. And to conform behavior, that is people who know that they are identified will fall into line with socially accepted practices and legal practices because they know about the previous point, accountability. Identification is also used for surveillance, and I use the word in a non-pejorative sense. That is, in some cases, you are watched and the information about you is put to good uses, and in other cases you are watched and the information about you is put to purposes that you don't like. But identification is absolutely necessary to surveillance so that information can be assembled about one particular person. Special purposes for identification that have been put forward and promoted as terror control include prediction, that is, surveillance allegedly would give information that would make available facts that reveal terrorists. Surveillance does does have some predictive uses in the commercial context. That is, if they know about your spending and most importantly, bill-paying behavior, it's a good guess that someone who's made a lot of payments on time will make payments on time in the future. It's a good guess that people who've consumed luxury cars in the past will consume luxury cars in the future. But the error rates in this kind of prediction are still good if the error rates are 90% or more. In terrorism, there are no distinct habitual precursors. That is, that there's no path that terrorists follow that we can study for years and years to improve our prediction rates from 99.9% to 100%. So I don't think there's an effective use of identification in predicting terrorism. Interdiction is another way that identification would allegedly advance terrorism control. But no significant terrorist attack has ever been committed by somebody who is actually entirely anonymous after the fact. I'm sorry, I've misspoken. That goes to the forensics point. Interdiction is the idea that you would grab terrorists before they act. Of course, to do that, you have to know who they are in advance, and that's the problem. The nub of the problem is to know who they are in advance. In all the major terrorist attacks we've had, once we knew who they were, it was very easy to pull the strings and find out where they'd been, who their accomplices were, and so on and so forth. The nub is to figure out who terrorists are, not systems that would track all of us in order to pick out one or two terrorists before they strike. Finally, forensics. Forensics is not a preventive measure. Obviously, it happens after the fact. And forensics, again, tracking everybody in order to create a system where forensics are effective is wildly out of balance with our national values. Attackers who actually maintain anonymity after the fact tend to be very ineffective. The two examples I know of are the Unabomber and Eric Rudolph. Now, they were substantial criminals, but they make fascinating crime stories rather than true threats to the American way of life and our sense of safety as we move through the world. So these latter three, prediction, interdiction, and forensics, are theories of how identification would serve anti-terrorism, and I think they fall down. The REAL ID Act is devoted to strengthening identification systems, again, in the name of terrorism, though probably more accurately, REAL ID is focused at immigration control through surveillance of work. The weaknesses in identification systems, though strengthened slightly by REAL ID, will continue to exist. One of the main ones is corruption of issuers. Throughout the country, year after year after year, we hear about people in DMVs who are paid hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars to issue IDs to people who shouldn't have them. And if the price, thanks to REAL ID, goes to $2,000 or $2,500, I don't think Osama bin Laden is going to throw up his hands and say, we're out of here, we're done. Likewise, fraud on issuers, improved slightly by REAL ID, is the idea of bringing in breeder documents and fooling DMV employees. It might get a little bit harder, but again, not so hard that it won't be done routinely throughout the country by millions of people, essentially because they want work, and with them will come people who want to commit acts of terrorism. Forgery of identification documents themselves might get a little bit more difficult under REAL ID, but not so difficult that it would prevent it ever happening. And finally, carelessness in checking ID cards against the bearers will not go away because of REAL ID. Some of these things can be improved by machine identification, but those implicate far greater surveillance and tracking than most people are willing to accept. So again, in the interest of brevity, I'll stop there, but those are the basic thoughts I have about identification.
Thanks, Jim. I'm Rhonda McLean. I'm the former CISO for Bank of America. I retired in early June, and now I have launched my own company, McLean Partners, Risk Partners, LLC. And I was really excited to be here today when I got asked to do this, because this is an important issue, I think, for everybody, whether you're someone that's trying to protect your customers or whether you're just a consumer yourself and you're worried about your own identity and how you might be in a position where you need to authenticate. I mean, when I came through the airport to come out to this meeting, I was asked for my driver's license. Okay, and they weren't going to accept my credit card even though it had my picture on it. So, you know, the Real ID Act that you're going to hear a lot more about, my disappointment with it, other than I think it's got a lot of work to be done on it, but my disappointment is that it's not a national driver's license, because I move around and I'd just soon not have to take the test. I mean, you know, you can go to the other countries and you have a national driver's license, and at least that would have offered us some convenience. But we are where we are, and that legislation has been passed, and I think it really means that we need to take an active interest in our state and federal government of how they are going to actually implement the Real ID Act. And instead of one leaky boat, we may have 51, because Puerto Rico is included in there. We may have 51 leaky boats. So we need to think very seriously from, I think, a 360-degree view of if we're going to implement this, which we are, based on what they're saying now through the passage of the ID Act, the Real ID Act, of really how do we secure this and we don't create unintended consequences. And I think that's the real danger with sometimes when we pass things very quickly in the middle of the night on appropriations bills, which is how this bill got passed. But I do believe, and this is from some of the experiences that I've had, and actually and also talking to many of my colleagues, that, you know, consumers and other entities really, I think if there was a commercial offering, if there was a robust, secure commercial offering that allowed a person to identify themselves for the purposes of authentication and entitlement and value-added capabilities, I think we would see many consumers want to opt in, and that's kind of a banking buzzword. But you can opt into using that and purchase your ability to have the convenience and to be able, perhaps it would be tied to identity theft insurance. There's a number of different commercial ways that I think that the model could be set up to be enticing to consumers. I think making it attractive to the general public, though, will require that the commercial offerings start with a strong privacy policy and contractual commitments, because at the end of the day, it really is going to be about having not only regulatory guidance there, but really the civil liabilities and civil penalties to incentivize that we do the right things in this kind of environment. So from my perspective, you're going to hear from the right here, you're getting ready to hear from the left, and I'm in the middle.
And I thought I was the right, and that was the left.
Oh, okay, well, yeah, you're right.
Hi, I'm Dennis Bailey. I'm very excited to be here today. I'm glad we had a good turnout. I work as the COO of Compter Systems. We're an IT firm in Washington, D.C. We do enterprise applications, data integration, and smart cards. I'm also the author of The Open Society Paradox, Why the 21st Century Calls for More Openness, Not Less. And in brief, it's kind of a lot of David Brin's ideas extended into a world of terrorism. I'm a strong believer in secure identification. I'm a strong believer in standards for identification. I don't know how many people listened to the last panel on data and information. I probably disagreed with about 90% of what I heard. I also just listened to Jim over here, and I probably disagreed with about 99% of what I heard. Really, what I'm what's that? Okay, I thought you said something. What I'm here to do today is to challenge everyone. I'm here to stir things up a little bit. I'm not here to be politically correct. I'm not here to confirm all your beliefs. I have one of my degrees is in psychology, and there's a principle called the confirmation bias, where people, because of their self-esteem, they seek out ideas and opinions that back what they believe in. So I ask everybody today just to put aside the emotion, put aside that confirmation bias, and just think critically about some of these issues rather than these quick responses that you see when people bring up the term national ID. And that's another thing I'd ask is that I don't like using the term national ID. Words have power, and the civil liberty crowd has been tying national ID to George Orwell for the last decade. That word is so negatively charged that you can't have a debate when you're already at a disadvantage like that. And there's a lot of other issues where how you frame the words impact the debate. I'd also ask that we try to avoid the slippery slope wherever we can. You can have a lot of fun speculating about the future, speculating about the dangers that Orwell prophesized about, even though Orwell was wrong about a lot of things. So I'd ask that we take our skis off and deal with the world as it is today. And then the last thing I'd say, we need to consider all the interests that we have in this room. I have personal interest in this, so I'm biased. I've got a book on the topic. My company does smart cards. Jim's representing the Cato Institute. They get money from people with certain interests. Security group out here, you have an interest. Privacy advocates get upset. That's more money in the pocket for a lot of the security people. Look at the government. They have an interest in security and terrorism. Every time there's a terrorism attack, they can try to grab more power. And the Iraq War was predicated on 9/11, which was a joke. So I think in these debates, you really got to take into account all the interest of all the parties. So I'll leave it at there.
Thanks, everyone. So to just give a quick introduction to the Real ID Act. In speaking to several of you earlier this week, I discovered that a lot of folks hadn't really been aware of the Real ID Act or some of its implications. I thought I'd start off with a quick flyby of what this is and what it means, so everyone has a good base footing to start from. I'm not going to read this entire slide, and most of these slides, because, well, I hope you can all read. But the important thing here is that basically in 3 years, we're going to have a driver's license that is linked to the federal government, and if your state chooses not to link their driver's license database to the federal government will not take that driver's license or ID card as proof of who you are. If you look at the list of requirements, most of these requirements are things that are already mandated by your state. California, has extra requirements. They require things like fingerprints. Illinois requires does facial recognition in addition to taking a picture. I believe Georgia also does fingerprinting. Thanks, Adam. So this stuff here isn't actually all that different from what you're seeing today, except for this 3-year requirement. Where it gets more interesting is that as you go to get your driver's license for the first time or get your driver's license renewed, you now need to prove evidence of lawful status that you belong in the U.S. And you can see there's a long laundry list of items here that allow you to prove that you're a citizen or have some legitimate reason for being in the country. Effectively what this item B here is saying is that DMV workers in every state now have to effectively become immigration officials and determine who is and who is not legitimately allowed into the states. Did you have a question back there?
You're assuming that they're going to be required to take action if they discover somebody's here illegally.
Well, they're required to not issue a driver's license, and they're also required. I'm sorry? Also, removing someone's ability to travel, however, is immigration and national border, and effectively this becomes a border control issue as well, is a federal issue, and they're now pushing this down to the states. And for most DMV officials at this point are not trained to identify these broad variety of documents. They have no ability to look at a piece of paper and say, well, yes, this is in fact a valid visa from the Department of Transportation. Additionally, now we have this problem where you also have to provide your social security number, and the states have to verify that social security number is valid as well. Once again, this is sort of a federal issue that's being pushed down to the states. It's not particularly an egregious issue in terms of a new thing. Most states already have your social security number from like 14 different other systems anyway. The really interesting requirements are here in that if a state chooses not to participate or chooses to issue licenses that are non-compliant with the federal requirements, they are mandated to produce them in such a way that it is clear that these are no longer are not valid as according to the federal government, which in my opinion, and we can, as my panelists will chime in I'm sure later, will produce a second-class citizen for any number of systems. The part that here scares me the most is items 12 and 13, which is the fact that suddenly we have a very largely linked database of all the driver's license data from all of the states in one large pile, which seems to be a little scary, at least for me, but I'm sure Dennis has a different opinion about that. At least I hope he does. So that's the basic idea behind the Real ID Act. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump to some questions for my panelists. Feel free to start asking questions yourselves from the audience. I'm not going to be all that formal about it. So if you have questions, please raise your hands or ask questions. Yes? Here, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I'm not really sure about the number of people that travel across the Canadian-U.S. border a year, but that's an awful lot of visa paperwork. It'll probably go a lot higher than a building in Vegas. And so is there any consideration to link in with the Canadian system? Because I looked at the attributes there that you have for the driver's licenses, and we have had those for 10 years up in Canada. So is there a possibility of linking it into a North American system, including the NAFTA countries?
Last I checked, you don't actually need a visa to enter the U.S. if you're coming from Canada. But there are some discussions, especially if you talk to the folks at the AAMVA, which is the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, who actually are very much behind this sort of thing. But do any of the panelists have a better answer to that than I do? Thoughts, response?
The only response I'd make, I mean, for the convenience of travel, we pretty much accept each other's identification. I mean, you don't have to have a passport to go to Canada. And does it? Okay, I didn't realize that. But in any event, I mean, I'm more worried about can we do what we need to do in the United States securely with the complexity and the scaling and the reliability and manageability of what we got to do. If anything, there may be more lessons that could be shared between the governments on how to do it effectively and not make some of the, you know, if there's lessons learned that could be applied within the U.S., I think there's great synergy there. But we definitely need a long-term plan for how we do these things.
I'm a strong advocate of linking of databases and using information in a number of ways. If I'm an identity thief and I get a driver's license in one state, even if it's a secure driver's license, I just can go to another state and get a different one. The terrorists on 9/11 had multiple identification cards, driver's licenses from multiple states. They targeted states that had the weakest standards. So I think having a federal standard, which is something that's a part of any modern economy, is that you have standards. I think as of 9/11, there were 311 different standards for driver's licenses. So I think that's a positive thing.
I guess on international travel, I'm not so concerned with identification requirements because nation states have the right to know who's crossing their borders. In the United States, we have the right to cross state borders, a right to travel, and of late that right is being diminished by requirements to show identification. As Real ID is implemented, that'll include having to prove that we're legally in the United States. In order to get the identification, we have to show to cross state borders as a practical matter. So these are real impingements on our rights as Americans, those of us who were born here. I was never issued a document saying that I was legally in the United States because I just showed up one day. I don't know where it is. It's your problem, not mine. I don't have it.
Scott, did you have a question?
Somebody with his name was born on that day.
Sure. There's no legal requirement that you have to show identification across state lines, but most of us cross state lines very often on on commercial transportation like airplanes. When the next bombing happens, that might be extended to buses. It's used sometimes in trains, particularly in the Northeast Corridor. So as a practical matter, without the existence of any rule that you have to prove your right to be in the United States, you will have to show identification that meets these federal standards to use commercial transportation. The policies are creeping, and not slowly, toward having to show identification and submit to searches in all kinds of areas where people congregate. The fact that it's airplanes is just a historical happenstance that the 9/11 attack had to do with airplanes. The search is happening in New York City now, and the subways have to do with the happenstance that attacks in London were on the subways. There's no logical ending point to this, obviously. Supermarkets, malls, train stations, buses, hotels. There's no end to the amount of checkpointing that could go on if we accept this kind of ID regime as terrorism security. It's not.
Well, how do you define between prudence and paranoia?
The question is, how do you define between prudence and paranoia? It's all paranoia, man. There can be intelligent risk assessment done. I'm a member of the Department of Homeland Security's Data Privacy and Integrity Advisory Committee, and I'm the co-chair of the Framework Principles Subcommittee. And we're only beginning our deliberations, but one of the things we're going to do is try to push risk management into our analysis of these programs. And that using risk management will highlight areas where there are weaknesses, will show where programs are aimed at the last battle or are misdirected or are overreactive to perceived threats. So there's a lot of work to do to get from paranoia and fear to real risk and real threat.
Can I want to ask a question? Sure. The example that you're using is one mainly, I think, on the paranoia side, which has to do with show me your papers, okay, so you can move forward, kind of the Nazi kind of thinking there. But, I mean, there's higher levels of assurance that we all appreciate that when we're asked for identification, that really serve our own individual purposes. And you know, when you checked into the hotel, you know, they not only ask for your credit card, right? They ask for your driver's license so that they could authenticate and validate to some level of assurance. It's not perfect. It's not a perfect world. It's not a perfect solution, okay? But it's used in an attempt to at least put a barrier there, to make it harder for criminals, okay, who want to masquerade as you. And it is a real fear. I mean, a lot of consumers are very frightened of losing their identity. So having a way to authenticate yourself, for me personally, it would be great to have a really secure authentication mechanism that would really validate that that driver's license or that commercially offered authentication, you know, individual authentication could be used so that the hotel doesn't worry that, you know, I stood out. If you saw Vegas Vacation, you know, I'm not George Papagopoulos, you know, so that it really is me and it really is my credit card that is being used.
Adam, did you have a point?
Just a couple points. For me, I think we're starting from a false premise. I think a key component of being a member of society is that you have to be identified. There are certain actions that people take that can have an impact on the community. If you buy a gun, that can have an impact on me. If you take out a home loan, that can have an impact on society. If you drive a car, that can have an impact. This idea that we shouldn't have to be identified in society, that's, I think it's mistaken.
Adam, did you have a question?
More comment. The use of ID when you check into the hotel has much more to do with protecting the hotel than its gambling operation
but it's mutually beneficial. Okay? It's not one or the other. It's from a personal perspective, I find it assuring that they want to know that it's my credit card. Okay? I do agree with what you're saying about how they use that information, and that really goes to the panel that I think talked before about who owns the data about you and how that data is used, which is a different issue. That's where I think the commercial entities come in, where I like an opt-in so that I have some say in how that data could be used for convenience reasons, or if I'm a frequent traveler so I don't have to wait in line and can be authenticated very quickly and go through, or if I want to have other value-added services that basically for convenience, it's a fast way where high levels of assurance is needed.
What's the value of an ID system, though, if all we're doing is raising very incrementally the cost to subvert that ID system to a kid buying a $5,000 game hardware now as opposed to being able to go to a store at home? I mean, I don't understand the purpose of having this great national ID when we're all being exposing ourselves to all potential future risks of misuse of that by the government and other organizations. When all we're doing is making it slightly more difficult than it is today to create a fake identity. I don't understand the value. What are we providing above what the states can provide today by nationalizing the identity system?
Well, actually, that's a good example, money. Look at all the changes we've done to make it more difficult to counterfeit bills. Take the starting point, take where we are today, it's tremendously more difficult to counterfeit. And I don't consider this incremental. Having encryption, digital signatures, the space on the cards, biometrics, that's a big jump from where we are today.
Except that there's no requirement for that, Dennis.
You guys are talking up here about, oh, this is stupid great, you're going to check in the hotel, they're going to know it's not going to be somebody who uses your card. The hotel, at least I hope for sure, is not going to have the ability to cross-reference you against some national identity database based on this card to determine whether or not you are what you say you are. I mean, if we're going to say that this is only going to protect us as citizens, and we're going to let every organization out here that wants to deal with this financially be able to cross-reference our identity against some master federal database, then stop trying to say that this is to protect us. This is to protect the organizations that hold power today, not protect us as citizens.
I say it protects us against identity theft.
Okay, hold on, excuse me, one person at a time, please. Okay, wait. Okay. Did you at least get a lousy T-shirt?
That's why I pay cash.
But they have to impersonate you to allow that transaction to go through.
Okay.
Let me go back to the last panel. There's all this talk about how do we protect data, how do we keep it secure, how do we have more regulations for privacy. I think we're looking at the issue in the completely wrong way. And actually someone started to hint at it, somebody up in the front here. Our data are spread across millions of databases around the country, around the world. The data is already out there. So do we focus on trying to lock down 1 million different databases, which would benefit your industry, or do we focus on a single point of failure, which is the driver's license, which serves as our piece of ID? So I think the emphasis should be on the other part of the equation, which is the people who perpetrate the fraud, making sure we identify who those people are and have a higher standard of authentication.
The gentleman here, I think, pointed out that what Real ID would do would raise a 3-inch fence against crime to being about a 6-inch fence against crime. Nobody's made the case that it would be an effective preventive of terrorism, But the case was made you could make it into a 2-foot fence of crime prevention if you had solid biometrics, encryption, and a federal database of all our actions and movements. Is that the way we want to go to prevent crime in this country? I doubt it.
How is that losing your civil liberties? If you look at what's happening, people outside of this group, majority of Americans are willingly giving their data over for all kinds of personalization services and conveniences. It's most Americans, if you ask them their top 10 issues, privacy is not going to be in that list.
Okay. So Dan, you had a question over there? Hey, they got a D+ last year. That's up from 2003.
What's in that database that threatens you so much that isn't already out there in a million other databases? And you think that's protected right now? You'd have to be crazy.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
And all I'm saying is, if you're going to verify it, you need to be able to trust the person is who they say they are.
Okay.
There's a lot of credit card fraud that is actually perpetrated by the actual owner of the credit card. So it's not enough to just go in and say I didn't do it, because there are a number of people who do claim that their card was stolen. It really wasn't me who bought it. When you do the investigation, what you find out, it really was the owner of that credit card. And I think we need to raise the level of discussion here a little bit, because I think we're getting hung up down in the dirt a little bit, down in the weeds a little bit. I think this is a higher level strategic issue about really where do we want to be as individuals. And if you had a way to authenticate that it really was you, okay, that was more secure, and I'm not a proponent necessarily of a federal leaky database, believe me. I do think if they're going to do this, I hope they really look at the security of this. But I think we as an industry could really influence how these things get secured, because I think it's naive to think you're going to stop it. Okay? You just really are naive. And you need to figure out you are where you are, so what do you do to make this viable? And going back again to this commercial idea, I mean, I'm going to use another example. I would gladly pay for something that authenticated me, that was in my wallet. And if I got in a car accident and was in a coma, had information on it, that actually a hospital could get online and say, this is really the Rhonda McClain, not another Rhonda McClain somewhere, where they could access my medical data very, very quickly to save my life. So I think we need to think about the scenarios and the value proposition of where something like this does have value. Okay.
Okay. A gentleman in the back in the black T-shirt has been waiting for like 20 minutes.
Wait, hold on. I'll try to answer that question. I see two ways that IDs can help prevent terrorism. Looks like you've got some supporters in the crowd. Okay, well, let me give you my thoughts. For one, if you've got a terrorist in the country, and say we are using intelligence, which you brought up as an important part of the equation, terrorist gets an ID out, and since we don't really have very good source documents, he says his name's Joe Schmo. Well, if investigators are hot on his tail, today he can easily change his name to something else to get another driver's license. The thing with a more secure identification card is that person's now locked into that identity. So that's it's called raising the bar. I know a lot of people in this room. Well, we can disagree on how secure an improved driver's license would be. The other point I'd like to make is that right now, London is investigating and trying to track down the July 21st bombers. And they're talking about a supposed fifth bomber. Say you swiped your card when you got on the metro, or the tube as they call it over there. That investigation would probably be over now, and they'd have tracked all those people down. But instead now they're spreading throughout the country. What's that?
Well,
no. What it does... It helps. One, you can find out what train they were on, and two, you've got a list of people, so you can go after it with intelligence, a group of people, and three, all the relationships to that suicide bomber. Even if he's dead, there's likely to be other people out there that are potential terrorists that are related to that guy that he's contacted. That's what intelligence.
That sounds a
all
lot
about.
like profiling, which is a dirty word around here, at least.
So how do you solve the problem? I've heard nothing here about how to solve the problem.
I'll put forward some ideas that I've had about trying to address the problem of identification and authorization while protecting against the Big Brother Orwellian things that absolutely will come to pass. Dennis, I'm kidding. There are a variety of budding potential identification systems out there that I think would provide a bulwark of liberty while allowing us to travel and pass through our society and use the full array of economic tools that we have. I recently testified in the House Homeland Security Committee about the Registered Traveler Program, and particularly the Orlando pilot of Registered Traveler has a private card issuer, and I have a mock-up of the card. It's called Clear. And the private card issuer collects information about you. You're subject to a government background check. And so I don't actually recommend the program, but it has elements that I think are good. And once you've passed that check, they issue a card that's tied to you through a pair of biometrics, fingerprint and iris scan. Then what they do is they have data resident at Orlando indicating which cards are okay, all clear to go through. And you go to the Orlando registered traveler kiosk and you get your iris scan and you put your card down, and it says the person who's attached to this card is entitled to go through. And an especially key point is that the card is privately issued. It has a privacy policy that promises to destroy the fact of your use of it within 24 hours. That's legally enforceable. And we all know about the imperfections in people's obedience to their privacy policies, but it's much better than any government program we've seen so far, which has never stated that they would destroy data and also would change on the whim of legislators. This is a real potential way out of this, is to preserve and extend the diverse, heterogeneous identification and authorization systems we already have. I go and talk to people all over the place, including state legislators who are generally quite a bit older and less aware than the people in this room, and I get them to take out their wallets and look through them, and they come to discover that the majority of cards they have, and certainly the diversity that they have, come from private issuers. Cards that don't identify very well because they don't need to, cards that identify pretty darn well, cards that don't identify but authorize. This is an example here. FlexCar card, which gives me access to a car, identifying me only to the system, and it could be extended where I could get access based on my good credit and good driving to other things without identifying myself. So I can travel in the economy and society without being subject to dossiers and databases. So there's a future.
Could you speak up a little, please?
I do own a passport and use it because I acknowledge the right of national governments to control entry and exit. The ID that controls my travel within the United States, access to transportation, access to hotels, banking, and so on and so forth, it's quite a bit different from entry and exit to the territory of the United States. It's supposed to entitle me to drive. Well, it's a
slippery slope that he's worried about.
We've been admonished not to go on the slippery slope, but if there is a slope before you, you might go down it. Packing all these uses onto the driver's license centralizes power with the issuer of the license. The heterogeneous, diverse identification systems diffuse power and prevent against any one institution, especially government, from having control over my movement and my economic behavior.
So the National Intelligence Reform Act of 2004 mandated a lot of these changes, as I spoke about earlier, in terms of what's being tracked, what's not being tracked. Two distinct differences between that act and the Real ID Act is one, that the National Intelligence Reform Act mandated that privacy be part of this new scheme. And the other part that I feel is very important is that it also mandated public input, neither of which exists in the Real ID Act, and both of which seem to be fundamental problems. And so my question for both my panelists and for you is, this complete lack of limitations on privacy or how data gets used, at least to me, is personally frightening, and I'm curious, what are your feelings on this, and how will this change our current relationships and our future relationships, both with the government and corporate America?
I have a couple points here. First, getting back to the earlier question, In my mind, with improved identification, you have improved freedom, flexibility, and mobility. Right now, flying through any airport, there's no reason that all of us should be patted down. If you've been a U.S. citizen in this country for 60 years, I just read the news this past week where a 60-year-old woman, retired teacher, was getting her breast patted down by one of the guards, and she got so upset she ended up patting down the breast of the security guard. That's crazy. But the reality is that's because of privacy. That's because when you have officials who know nothing about you, they can't trust you at all, they have to be more intrusive than if you had identification that said, hey, I'm a citizen, great record, no need to bother me. Now, if you're the next person in line and you're from Pakistan, you've only been here for a couple months, you don't have a record of trust, then maybe you get a pat down.
Okay.
That's the one point. Getting back to data, though.
Okay, I have one point, and then we have an audience question. The first point is that none of the July 7th London bombers had any record and were well trusted, as far as we know, individuals, aside from that little bombing incident. So, I mean, how would your system have protected that particular incident from happening? Is my question for you to think about.
Yeah, they travel. Timothy McVeigh is the exception. Are we under a threat from Nazi supremacist groups in the country right now? No.
Yes. In the red shirt? Could you stand up? Speak up. Okay. The question for everyone who couldn't hear it was, it's been proposed that national ID cards of a sort would be a precursor to more easily enabling national electronic voting. Is that correct? And so the question was, how do the panelists feel about that? And how would the systems that have been proposed so far assist or disable that effect?
Well, it's interesting. When I'm more for the privatization of this, so I think we're probably more closely aligned. But when I get my driver's license in North Carolina today, I register my party affiliation. And in North Carolina, like many states, when I go to the polling, they may not ask me for anything. I just go in and sign my name. Okay? It's pretty pathetic. I mean, I actually like the idea that they would check to see that I am who I say I am. I just don't want them to know how I vote. So there's a difference, I think, between authenticating for the right and the entitlement and the privilege and the tracking of the transaction. And so, whether this is a private offering, because I don't think each state controls their own polling machines, their own polling laws right now. I think it remains to be seen how they might use this. This might be an opportunity for them to do it. But I'm a big proponent, if we're going to have this, to at least have raised the bar, as you've said. Okay, raise the bar and substantially raise the bar with the biometrics, like the travel card. Because basically, once he authenticates himself for his convenience, it's a very convenient service for you to go through very quickly. They don't necessarily know where you're going. Okay, they don't know necessarily what you're doing. You've just been given the privilege to have access to get to the airplane. So I personally think that that's a really important thing, and it's something that's really needed from public policy.
I'm just going to raise a couple points before we run out of time, just so I can stir things up a little bit. I don't believe that people own their data. The idea is that a couple analogies. Personal data. I'm all for protecting copyrights. The example is if you buy a lawnmower from Sears, you can go tell Consumer Reports that thing is a piece of crap. Or the other analogy is gossip. I can sit down, find something about you, and I can go tell that to somebody else. So I think there's a false idea that you own your information. There's a patchwork of laws that allow you some control. What was my other point? The other point was let's take care of the Social Security number problem. Let's just release all Social Security numbers.
Okay,
and let's use them as a key and not as a password.
Okay, so Dennis, would you be willing to tell everyone your Social Security number?
In unison.
Well, you're the advocate for openness, so you should lead us. Yeah, Scott?
I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea of the privatization of the ID card, but I'm curious how we avoid a usability problem where I would need to carry a strong identification token for every major institution that I would do business with. I need to have maybe a place one, a driving one to get on the bus, one to get on the train, one to talk to my bank, one to talk to my brokerage, one to talk to my doctor, right? And how many of these would I have to carry around?
Terrorists might opt out.
The question was complicated. Do you want to answer or do the question was, how do we get around this if you're gonna do a variety of IDs? You're gonna have one for every different transaction you might have. My quick stab at it is that you already have that. You also have a variety of keys on your key ring, and you're much more secure having a different key for your house, your car, your safe deposit box, your office. There's a good reason for that we don't unify all our physical keys in one place. There's a mix.
Just like those 20 passwords you have to memorize.
And it's good for driving. Use it, man.
This guy right here, he's had his stand up for the whole session.
I don't know, my dog has them. I mean, I love my dogs. I mean, I think that's a personal decision. I mean, yeah. But this is not a technology question. It's really about your desire for personal preference, okay, and whether you want to opt in. I opt in to have chips put in my two dogs, okay, and well, I didn't implant them in my kids if that's what you're asking, because they're grown. They'll have to opt in on their own. But
really, where I come down is the whole focus is on civil liberties. Okay, if they're tracking you, that's one thing. But are they using that information to deprive you of any of your rights? It's one thing if they have your information. And for example, this is what I love about HIPAA. HIPAA, for the most part, I disagree with most of it. It's got all these crazy privacy regulations where doctors have to redo all their offices. It's just crazy. The one good thing it does, it says you can't discriminate against an employee if they have a medical condition. And what that says is you don't try to hide your personal information from your employer, because, I mean, you could see somebody sick, you might overhear them in the cubicle. What it says is you can't discriminate. You can't fire that person. You can't try to deprive them of insurance or raise their rates. And that focuses on not on all these databases, but the consequence of using the data. So I think the focus needs to be on the other side of protecting civil liberties with that. And in a more open society, it's becoming much more easier to do that.
I'll say that Rhonda hit on something by using the word choice in response to your question. Dennis and you, sir, can choose to use a single uniform identification system that reports to the government on your movements. I can't choose not to participate in Dennis's system. And so civil liberties, yeah. Freedom generally go out the window. A unified identification system controlled by the government puts us at
What
risk
freedoms?
of official seizure. It's a system that fails dangerously. You all know what a fail-safe is, right? If the system breaks, you're still safe. Well, if our democracy breaks and we have a uniform identification system, administration of that tyranny is really easy. If our democracy breaks and we've got a diverse, difficult communication system, it's hard to administer tyranny. So think of diverse identification as a fail-safe.
This is the 1940s, Jim, and if you look around the world, there's dozens of democracies that haven't slipped into tyranny because of national ID systems. Oops, I said that word, sorry.
Okay, the gentleman in the back in the check shirt, the plaid. The question was, why doesn't anyone on the panel want to know how the government to know how we voted?
I think it's a privacy issue. I mean, I think your personal freedom to exercise your political freedom to vote is a right and a privilege. But, I mean, I think by law, you know, it is not the government's option to say how you voted. They count the votes, but it shouldn't be tied back to individuals for the very reasons, some of the very reasons that Jim is talking about. I mean, I do think that there is checks and balances that our Constitution gives us, and I think we need to really keep those sacred, and the balance of power. I mean, a lot of this, and you know, what's being promoted really on both sides really is incumbent upon us. Okay, and also we need a vigilant press, which I'm not convinced today we do have. I think we need to beef up some of these things that will help us point out where we have weaknesses in the system, where abuses of power are being exercised, to ensure that we are able to freely move about, make choices, but also be able to demonstrate that we do have the privilege and the right to take advantage of whether it's voting or whatever the privilege might be. I'm not backpedaling. I don't want them to know how I vote. I'm not backpedaling. I want them to know that I had the privilege to vote, but it's none of their business how I voted, except in the count. I want the count to be accurate, okay? And so, you know, I don't want my dead brother-in-law being used to vote for the purposes of distorting our democracy. So I do want the people that have the privilege to vote to be authenticated, and I want them to count it accurately, but they don't need to know the personal individuals and how they voted. That's a personal decision. It's like religion. It's nobody's business, the religion or the belief system. So there are certain things that I think are very sacred to our privacy, and that what make us different in this country. The Constitution.
Yeah.
One good point you made was the accountability piece, where you've got thousands of special interest groups, Cato Institute doing a great job keeping their eye on the government. You've got media covering every move officials make. John Ashcroft couldn't go to the bathroom without someone knowing about it. Now you've got millions of bloggers who are watching every move the government makes. I mean, there's much more accountability out there, so I don't think there's all this doom and gloom. We still have to be very cautious anytime you grant the government additional powers. I'm not saying that.
Okay. In the black shirt with the white collar? Yes.
And that goes back to one of your charts.
Well, here's your list of people who are allowed to get driver's licenses now under the Real ID Act. So if you don't see them there, well, they're screwed. Sorry.
Question down here?
gentleman in the back over here, black shirt.
It's a good question. And the question was, people who didn't hear it, let's grant that we all want privacy based on our movements, purchases, and so on and so forth, but there are huge databases used by marketers right now. What about that? And it's a good point. It troubles people deeply. My thinking is that marketers, companies that use those marketing databases, are all subject to a variety of sanctions, some of which were discussed on the previous panel, I think, very well, very eloquently. Legal sanctions, market sanctions, a variety of different things. When governments get that information, they're not subject to law. They're lawmakers. And they change laws after they acquire data. Privacy Act, well, how shall I put this, is a joke because they can change the use of data based on a Federal Register notice. Just publish it and use data differently. The Congress can come in and change the use of data that's been collected. They do it regularly with the National New Hires.
So it's published, it's public information, how they're using it?
That's right. And
That's accountability, right?
That's a skosh of accountability. But they collect it under one premise and shift to another use at will, without any recourse by citizens other than exiting the country. So the important thing for me that I emphasize is the actors involved. You're generally safer, but people don't like this. They do these things. You're generally safer dealing with private sector entities of all kinds because there are remedies against them. You're generally less safe. You're unsafer, which is now a new word. Dealing with governments.
Safe from what, though? Where are the threats? There's all this data out there today. What's the big threat? Identity theft? Is that the big threat?
From governments, the threats are arrest, detention, search, seizure of your property.
They have plenty of databases today, and they can track you down and do all of that just as easily.
Well, not all of us are members of the Don't Worry, Be Happy caucus. We prefer to actually put limits on our government.
I'm just being realistic.
Okay, on that note, we have time for one more question. Yes, then we can go to the bar, Rhonda. Okay.
It's too late for that. I can Google you right now and get tons of information from you, and it's only going to get worse. 10 years from now, we're going to have perfect facial recognition, and this is going to be a mute debate. I could stand on the block and watch your face 5 times a week.
I think you bring up a really great point because I think it's a solution kind of thinking, and it goes back to something that I said at the very beginning. In order to not have unintended consequences, we need to really think through and scenario how we're going to use, how systems are going to be used, whether it's the Real ID, whether it's commercial systems. I mean, I read Jim's testimony, and it was excellent. I would highly recommend you read it. And he made a very good point. One of the things with the National Traveler is they store the travel information, if I remember this correctly, you correct me if I'm wrong, in a central database. Well, why not just keep it there in the local on site and not put it to any database. So I mean, I think that you got to really go through the scenarios, how the system would work. Are there other recourses and things like the ability with the Freedom of Information Act to go find you as an individual who's been looking at you? Those are the kinds of critical thinking, I think, that needs to happen, and the debate needs to occur so that we make, hopefully, we learn lessons from history and we learn lessons from the critical thinking, and as we implement these things, we've thought them through, and if we make mistakes, we're willing to change.
Okay, unfortunately, I've just gotten the high sign that we do need to end. I want to thank my panelists. We'll be outside out front so we can keep talking about this, but we need to make room for the next panel. So thank you, everyone.